Okay, I am gonna go ahead, even though no one's here. I ran into another problem with YouTube, but it's just so frustrating. Let's see if I can't. Yeah, so I know a lot of people switched over to YouTube. It's the preferred way to go about it. It's easier, but so I am recording this part of the lecture. I'm going to pick up where we left off. Unfortunately, one of the things that happened is, you know, the whatever's going on with, and IT is supposed to be coming here. We'll deal with that. But for whatever setup, like it's designed that it sort of puts up a firewall whenever it thinks something is happening that it shouldn't be happening. And because OBS is not WebEx or Panopto, right, it's saying, no, you can't do that. Or it's saying you're streaming to two different things, right? And for whatever reason, it's just not allowing me to stream to YouTube right now. And the laptop that I had, it died for whatever. It's just a bunch of technological problems. Because of that, I'm just going to have to. I am recording the YouTube. I'm recording this on YouTube, and it'll be posted as soon as this class is over. But I can't live stream through that, which is very frustrating. I understand that you're frustrated. I'm frustrated, right? That this should not be the headaches we're having this far into the semester. But IT told me that they fixed it this morning, and then it's not working again. So it's just a continuing battle. If you're watching this, like I can't upload it, but if you're watching this as a recording, just know that we'll continue to work with it. And the other option, right, is to watch it after the fact, but I don't really want that to be the standard. So please move back into WebEx if you can when you don't see it up. But for now, I just need to cover this material, and I can't stop when the... Why is this being so difficult? There we go. Right, we can't just stop at every point that has some sort of technical difficulty, especially because I have to get this material. When we go over the exam review, you know, I'll talk to you. They're supposed to be bringing a laptop, so who knows what'll happen in the next 15 minutes. But for now, let's just cover the remaining slides through WebEx. It's being recorded on YouTube, so it will be posted later. I continue to hate this system, but hopefully we'll get, I'll get some clearer answers later. So continue to see that. So let's get back into this, right? We talked about the sort of Western response. Right, we talked about when we have a abuse, you know, what is the Western response? How does that work? And so the first part that we want to recognize is that when you have information about something that's occurring, right, this access information is very clearly part of an NGO process, right? That if you have a community, if you have an non-government organization, they're going to be providing a lot of information to Western states that's going to help them know about the problem. So a state will not respond to something unless it knows about it, right? So basic access information is clearly the first step. The next part is national security and national interest. We talked about this already, right? Why did the European Union care about Kosovo, the issue in Kosovo or Serbia, right? When there was all this, it's because it threatened state security. That European states were near enough, right? Their borders were close enough to Kosovo that it was going to impact their behavior. And so they wanted to protect their state security and deal with that issue domestically rather than have it spill over and cross into their borders, right? We've seen that, right, one of the issues of Syria, right? That Syria starts as a civil war, right, a few years ago, several years ago now, but it spills over. That Turkey demands that the NATO engages with Syria because their border is being crossed over. So Proximity issue is very important, and the state interest, right? We already talked about oil in Iraq and Kuwait, right? That Iraq invades Kuwait. Kuwait has a military alliance with the United States. The United States protects Kuwait and then pushes back into Iraq to damage the ability of that military to go into Kuwait because they're defending the oil that's in that region, right? So it's in the national interest of the United States to protect Kuwait. Now, what this creates is a very obvious sort of blind spot, right? It is not the first time that when powerful states talk about Africa, they sort of talk about it being the dark continent, right? Until the mid-20th century, if you were a European and you went into Africa, right, sub-Saharan Africa specifically, there was a very high percentage chance that you would die from malaria, right? The northern and western populations couldn't live in any real sense in sub-Saharan Africa, right? The mosquitoes and malaria were much more deadly. And there's a whole history and evolutionary argument, right, that sickle cell is a defense to malaria, right? But sickle cell anemia is when that defense causes problems, right? It's a recessive gene. So, right, you have this before the 20th century, before about 1950, you have this real biological evolutionary barrier that sort of keeps colonial powers from really being that present on the African continent. Afterwards, after World War II, you have all these states that are gained independence, that they're not colonial powers. And so then what happens is Western states don't have any interest, right? It's not about a biological barrier. Now it's about just a lack of interest, that the states don't have any reason to engage in African politics or electoral politics in Africa, especially sub-Saharan Africa, because it doesn't matter, right? That they're not interested. So again, right, does the Western state care what's happening? The next we talked about is domestic constituencies. Now, when you're talking about domestic actors internationally linked, right, if you're a banker and investor, right, you care about foreign direct investment. If you're a factory owner, you need to export your goods. So you need to know that the trade relationship you've set up with a corporation in the West is going to be maintained, right? And some of these are about these sort of democratic norms. One is property ownership, right? That the government's not just going to come and take the factory and nationalize it, because that would damage it. And the other thing we've already talked about is freedom of capital, right? Can money move freely between states? And if not, Western investors don't want to go into that state, right? And that's all driven by rule of law, right? If the laws are clear that you can't just take someone's property or that capital can move around freely, right? A more capitalist, rule of law, democratic system, at least in the formal institutions, then you're going to have better investors, right? Tourism exports, right? You need trade partners for tourism. You need to seem like a stable regime. So even if you're not democratic, you need to be a stable competitive authoritarian regime to make sure that people feel comfortable coming to those places, right? Tourism in Mexico took a really big hit, right, when you sort of had these drug cartel wars over the last 10 to 15 years, right? Now sort of moving past that as the police sort of retake over. But tourism declined in Mexico during that time period, the first part of the 21st century, because of all this concern about criminal and drug cartels, and even though they weren't present in tourist areas, right, there was that concern, right? The same with sort of Caribbean islands, right, the Dominican Republic, all these places that rely on tourism for their economy, they want to avoid seeming unstable, so they want to sort of push their domestic population to sort of ensure that they don't have sort of clear authoritarian behavior. And then international standing, right? That sanctions and trade barriers can really impact your economy, and it's important to recognize when your economic interests are more important than sort of democratic interests, right? You might want to be balanced and have formative democratic institutions, but you're willing to not have true democracy in order to stabilize your economy. So the next part is distribution of power, right? If you have protection, if the opposition is protected, as the Zapatista rebels in Mexico were, right, by Western powers, right, then it's harder for the incumbent party to remove that opposition group, right? And when you don't have the protections, you see things like Navalny. And Navalny is an opposition leader in Russia today, right? He's in jail right now. He was arrested. Whether or not the criminal charges are real is hard to say. I don't have all the details. I mean, we just don't have all the details. But before this, right, many Russian opposition leaders, opposition to the Putin regime, right, the Putin government that has existed for a long period of time, we would call that a stable, competitive, authoritarian regime. They have often, right, attacked, killed, right, eliminated, arrested opposition leaders, but they do it in a way where it looks like it's not connected to the state, or that legal repression where they charge them with a crime and it just might be a partisan application of crime, right? They say you're committing a crime, and then the opposition group says, well, everyone's doing this, right? And the incumbent party says, well, you're being punished for it, right? That's that competitive authoritarian aspect to legal repression. Right, it's partisan, it's one-sided, it's not being applied to the incumbents. The next part is the NGOs, INGOs, and TANs, right? International, it's non-governmental organizations, intergovernmental organizations, and transnational advocacy networks, right? I don't expect you to learn the acronyms. I just want you to know that these organizations, they help opposition groups gain resources, whether it's access to the media or campaign funds, or helping them set up their organizations, right? Or giving them bureaucratic systems that they can use. And then it's also election monitoring and human rights monitoring, right? Many of these organizations, part of what they do is they come in as international observers and they try to identify places in which human rights abuses are occurring or in which election fraud is occurring, right? And so if you're a competitive authoritarian regime, you want those international observers there because they give you legitimacy, but you don't want to get caught committing fraud. So it's a very tight rope that you have to walk because you want the legitimacy of international observers, but ballot box stuffing can be caught, right? Intimidation can be recorded, and so it's this very difficult thing to do, but if you can do it, you can retain power as the incumbent and get support from the West because it looks like you had a free and fair election, right? That's the ultimate goal, right? You don't have to share power with the opposition, and yet you get applauded for being a democratic state, for seeming like a democratic state. Now, the opposition has a lot of benefits, right? They can come in and say, if you elect me, the opposition leader, I already have ties to the West. I already have connection to Western powers. So when I gain power, one of the things that can happen is I can go and talk to my Western allies and say, stop these sanctions, stop this embargo. And as a real quick note, a sanction is where a state says that private companies can't trade with that state, right? So a sanction on Iran would say American companies can't trade with Iran, even through a third party. So you can't have Iran sell to Brazil and then Brazil sell to the US, right? That's illegal as well and under a sanction, right? Goods can't be sold to the United States if the US sanctions Iran, right? That they try and block off all trade ties of private companies. An embargo is much more severe. An embargo is essentially a powerful state surrounds, often with a military force, a state, or blocks their waterways or their access to trade and doesn't allow the goods of that state to go anywhere. An embargo says you can't trade with anyone, right? A Cuban embargo is ships that block trade coming out of Cuba, right? And the Iranian embargo, right? There's a Strait of Hormuz, there's a waterway that a lot of goods come out of Iran, and American naval ships just blocked it. And any ship that was coming out of Iran or shipping Iranian goods was turned around at threat of being sunk, right? So an embargo is very severe. So if you're the opposition and say, look, we're having a really hard economic time because the current incumbent, right, has Western threats against them because they're not following democratic principles. If you elect me, the opposition, I'll talk to my people in the West and we'll get rid of these, right? And so it empowers opposition because they can say, my links to the West can help us economically. I can make things better right away when I come to power, right? And sometimes it's about legitimacy, but usually it's about economic ties. And so then there's this within-party aspect that we have to recognize. The within-party aspect is part of a system in which you see the party itself, the incumbent party, realize that they have to make some change. Right? The first is if the leader is despised internationally, you might say he's got to go. Right? That individual has to go. we have to replace that individual, and then someone else will take power, will argue, the incumbent will say, well, we got rid of him, we're a better party now, you don't have to treat us the same way because that person didn't represent us, right? This is in part sort of the Gaddafi argument. Gaddafi at times was very popular in Libya, but had a lot of disdain from Western states. So at first, when Libya was sort of shifting, the party started to argue, well, we don't want to have a complete revolution. We don't want an Arab Spring in Libya. We don't want a change in power structure. We're just going to get rid of Gaddafi, right? And then Gaddafi actually dies horrifically in the street, right? Why do leaders fear losing power, right? Gaddafi's a prime example. You could then be murdered because you don't have your coercive apparatus to protect you, right? So while the morality and the normative aspects of being a dictator have all these problems, right, the logic of not wanting to give up power has very real rational explanations, right? And so the party starts to say, okay, we'll just switch. The other thing that can happen within a party is they can say, well, all these sanctions, all these embargoes, I'm losing all the resources that I would have from being part of this party. So why would I want to stay in a party that has all these problems when I could just be part of the reform? I can say, you know what, let's democratize, right? Why are we fighting so hard to keep power when we're not getting anything from being in power? Let's democratize, let's end the sanctions and the embargoes, let's have better trade relations with the United States, and through that process, right, be better off than we were just being in power. Let's just become a democracy and try to compete in elections, and even if we don't retain power, we'll still be elites in a system, and we'll end up being better off, right? So within the party, you also have this impact of leverage. So the first, we want a couple points. The first is that there's a cluster effect. Sometimes in biology, we call this emergent properties. And that just means that, you know, if you take each individual factor, you may not get what you expect. But if you combine those factors, right, this is the greater than the sum of the parts, right, you might end up with an effect that leads to regime change, that leads to a transition, because they sort of combine with each other, right, linkage and leverage. The other part is that linkage and leverage, they overlap. It's hard to distinguish which is which, right? That if you have a trade relationship, if you have open trade, this is part of this dependency theory, which we got into a little bit, but we won't spend as much time on. It's more of an IR concept. That's the only reason why we're not going to focus on it. International relations concept rather than a comparative politics concept. But if you have open trade, the West can say, look, we're buying all of your textiles, right? South Korea had this problem when it was trying to industrialize, right? When it was trying to build up Daewoo, is mostly it was Western states buying the textiles from South Korea. And Western states, right, Western European and the United States, right, they would pressure South Korea and say, look, we're buying all your textiles. If you don't open up your markets to our vehicles, to our cars, or if you don't improve your labor suppression, we're going to stop buying your textiles. And South Korea had to maneuver this process where, like, okay, we are going to democratize in some ways, but we're not going to let up on labor suppression, and we're not going to open up our markets to vehicles until we've developed our Daewoo car manufacturing plant, right? Our car industry through Daewoo. And so those linkage and leverage, those are both things that impact, but the line between which is which isn't quite clear, right? They overlap a great deal. The other part is non-Western linkage, right? You'll see this is going to come up quite a few times in these Black Nights, right? That China and Russia are much more powerful than their neighboring states, right? China's neighbor, India, is sort of different, but a lot of states that neighbor China don't have power to sort of compete with China in an economic sense or in a military sense. And Russia, while it is no longer the superpower it was during the Cold War, is still a very large economy with a lot of people, right? China and Russia are large in territory, they're large in population, they have a lot of natural resources, right? They are going to be powers in the system because of geographic factors, right? The United States, Russia, and China are always likely to be powers in the system because of the way they're developed, right? Their territory and the resources that are controlled. Brazil's the same way, right? Brazil, Russia, India, and China, these BRIC countries, they're powerful rising powers because they have those factors, they have geographic factors, right, that the US has had for a long time, and of course the US has had an advantage because it's been in power for a long time. But those states are going to counterbalance against the Western influence, especially the United States, because they want to have their own spheres of influence. The other part is that sometimes you might have anti-democratic factors from these states, right? If we think about China, China's not a democracy, right? They don't claim to be a democracy, right? They have a communist party, right? They are not a competitive authoritarian regime. They're not putting up this facade. They're powerful enough in the system that they don't have to deal with. They can sort of not be pressured by Western ideals or Western norms of democracy. So if you're a small state and you're trying to get a loan, China doesn't care if you're democratic. It doesn't care if you have any of the democratic trappings. It just cares if you can pay back the loan, right? If you can effectively pay back the loan in a way that benefits China. So you can borrow from China and not face these democratic conditions on loans. That's the first part, because they're not concerned. The other part is the case of Turkey. In Turkey, one of the things that happened is that it needed to borrow from the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. It was dealing with the balance of payments problems. It wasn't making enough money and revenue to pay its monthly bills. And so it needed a restructuring of its debt to borrow. And the IMF was saying, well, some of the conditions on this loan are that you're going to have to be more capitalist and open trade, and you're going to have to behave more democratically, right? All of these conditions on the loans. And so Turkey didn't want to take the IMF loan because it didn't like the conditions, and it didn't think the conditions would really benefit the economy of Turkey. So China offers a loan instead. And the loan says, you can keep your bureaucracy. You can keep your institutions. You don't have to democratize. You don't have to open up trade. All you have to do is change a few things to make sure that you can pay back this loan, right? And so Turkey borrowed from China rather than the IMF. And that gives China power. One, it's an economic alternative to the global systems, the IMF, the World Bank, but also now it has influence. China can put conditions on loans. China can influence those weaker states rather than the Western powers. And so China's sphere of influence grows. And not that that is bad, good, whatever, but obviously that's going to limit democratic factors when you come to loans and linkage, right? Because China and Russia really are going to influence they're going to have their own influence, and they have interests other than Western influence. The next part is linkage and democratization, right? We talked about this. If you have an abuse, right, people are going to see it. The more linked, the more likely people are going to see abuses and going to want to respond to abuses. And so you just can't have abuses. And when you're very strongly linked, right, people care more about just elections, right? They care about all the time. So in between elections, often in between elections, authoritarian or competitive authoritarian regimes would get away with a lot, and they would behave during elections, right? So if you have strong linkage, you're going to catch those between election behaviors. We already talked about, right, if you have stronger linkage, it's easier to leverage, right? If I have a domestic population, I can put more pressure. If I have a population that includes, right, say Koreans, right, the United States can connect with those Koreans to put pressure on South and North Korea. If I, right, have high trade linkage, that gives me more leverage because that weak state is more vulnerable to trade relationships with the West. So linkage increases leverage, right? They're connected in that way, right? Which is also why they overlap, because when does one start and when end, right? And then domestic actors are empowered, right? So if you see that you're supported by Western perception, then you're going to feel empowered. And also, right, that if you have a successor who takes power over an incumbent, they might fear that they'll get punished if they don't start to democratize. They might feel like there are more incentives to build more democratic informal institutions and behave more democratically. And so the domestic actors are seeing that there are punishments for not democratizing and the rewards for democratizing. And so when you have a change in leadership, they say, well, the incentives are better for me to democratize, and I may not be in power the whole time, but for the 4 to 6 years that I am in power, I will be better off. And I may be even able to collect more resources in that time period. And that way I don't have to stay in power forever. I only have to stay in power for 4 years, and I can make a bunch of money and put it in my pocket. And then if I lose power, that money is there for me once I leave. If I am exiled or something, I can go live in Argentina, or I can go live in some small island country and be wealthy and protected. So there are 4 different cases. We're going to talk not really that much about them, but where places that have high leverage and high linkage, high leverage and high linkage. So Eastern Europe and the Americas are the most obvious. They're in proximity, right? If you have violations, they did get international attention, right? We saw in Kosovo in the past, we saw in Mexico, right? We cared about violent behavior or autocratic behavior. You have domestic constituencies, right? That in the United States, there are a lot of people of Mexican descent that care about what happens to people in Mexico, and this ties to the policies of the elected officials in the United States, right? If you're an elected official in California or in Arizona, right, the behavior of Mexico is very important to your constituents, and so you're tied to that through your own constituencies. And so what happens is autocrats are just unlikely to survive, right? The autocrat is unlikely to be able to stabilize, and, right, the push for democratic norms is more likely as new people come in, right? As a successor comes in, they're more likely to cause that. What happens when you have high linkage but low leverage? You still have a push for democratic institutions, right? The government, the United States government, didn't actually put that much pressure on Mexico or Taiwan to democratize. The pressure came from the media, from these networks, from these non-governmental organizations, from these transnational advocacy networks. And so it was the private sector that was really pushing for reform in Mexico and Taiwan. And so the government didn't have to provide direct pressure, but the linkages existed with those connections. So clearly linkage is more important than leverage. Not if you can leverage someone, but if the links are there, that they feel connected, that the leverage is possible, right? So linkage is the more important. And what makes that clear is that when you have low linkage in a place like Russia, there's just not enough pressure, right? Putin has violated democratic norms over and over again, right? Putin, right, he would say he annexed, or that the Crimea was always part of Russia, which Russia, Soviet Union expansion, there's all these questions. But the Russian leader, Putin as leader of Russia, right, and the Russian government took a part of Ukraine. They took territory from another state. And the response was very minimal because the linkage wasn't there, right? Most Americans were like, I don't want to get involved in whatever's happening in Russia. But also, we don't have any trade relationships or vulnerabilities that we can pressure. Russia has its own strong economy. We can't really turn the screws. And there isn't this connection, ideological or social or diplomatic, that allows the West to put pressure on. And so what happens is you have these serious abuses, and they do not lead to strong pressures. In the rhetoric they do, but in action they do not lead to strong pressures to democratize Russia. So then we get into the really big contribution from Levitsky and Way, and that's organizational power. And this is the last part that we're going to talk about as we finish. It's a little bit long and detailed, but I really want to get through it in the next half hour, and it shouldn't be a problem. I think it's way more slides than I want it to be. Okay. So the first is it's the domestic dimension, right? It is the part of the equation that they want to talk about, the agency part that's not driven by international behavior. There's existing theory about opposition, how organized the opposition is, right? If you have a very organized opposition, they're much more likely to gain power. But what this does is it ignores the incumbent strategy. And Levitsky and Way use this analogy or sort of metaphor or whatever it is that they describe it as the 3 little pigs, right? And they say, it doesn't matter how hard the wolf howls, if your house is made of brick, it's going to stand, right? And so it doesn't matter if the international community is putting on this pressure. If you have a really stable organization, a really stable, cohesive party, then the international pressure just won't make that much of a difference. And so the first example we use is, why do so many states in Africa democratize? Well, they were bankrupt. They had no coercive apparatus. The elites were completely fragmented, and when the Soviet Union collapsed, they had no money for their security forces. So when you don't have any organization, no incumbent party organization, and you have a very weak state, of course you're going to democratize, because there's nothing worth protecting. No incumbent party says, I have to maintain in power, because there's nothing that they're getting from being in power. There isn't all this wealth that they can accumulate from being in power. So they're like, we might as well democratize. I'm not going to fight you, right? If you want to be in power, let's just compete and run elections, right? And they might not be free and fair. There's all this intimidation, right? Because the democratic norms might need time to develop, but there's no reason to fight over power because there's just not enough there to fight for, right? In a larger sense, right? On the opposite end, places like Armenia and Zimbabwe, they remain authoritarian, right? Because they have this really effective coercive apparatus, right? Armenians, as they're becoming after the Cold War, they've just come back from a separate war, which we're not going to get into, right? But you have all these veterans that are like, we just set up this country, and then there are all these challenges to change it, and these veterans say, no, I just fought for this thing that I have. And so I don't want it to change, I just fought for it, and they push back opposition, and then the repression, the coercive repression that exists in Zimbabwe is so good at what they do and so willing to kill opposition that it stops cold the ability for power transfer and democratization, right? And so we see there's a difference, right? You have to have some domestic capacity that includes repression, the coercive apparatus, the organization of the incumbent party. So there are a couple of mechanisms for this organization: coordination, monitoring, and enforcement. And what we're going to see is you really need monitoring and enforcement. Now, coordination comes with these two things, but if you can monitor everyone what they're doing and you can have strict enforcement, the opposition just won't have the ability to take power. So you have state and party organization. The first thing they do is split. What is the organization of the state and what is the organization of the party? And the state organization deals with two things: high-intensity coercion and low-intensity coercion. And high-intensity coercion is most exemplified by crackdowns, really violent crackdowns on behavior. Now, when you have high capacity when you have capacity for high-intensity coercion, you see things like Tiananmen Square. Now, Tiananmen Square in 1989 occurred in China, where you had protesters who went to a place where you had, in the past, had protesters to gather. Tiananmen Square had been a place where protesters would gather, where opposition groups would come together, and you have these protesters come together, and the Chinese state, right, as sort of communism sort of gets solidified in China, sends in tanks. So you have civilian protesters, peaceful protesters, and then you have tanks come in and kill some of the protesters. It is a very violent, coercive behavior. And what happens is the opposition group is shattered. Because the opposition says, well, if we're going to try and take power, or we're going to try and compete in elections, and you're going to kill us, then we don't feel safe to do so. And so Tiananmen Square is really this change in China's behavior where it becomes really communist, and it sort of fills this gap that the Soviet Union had left behind, right? The Soviet Union is collapsing, and then China says, we're going to stay communist, we're going to solidify, and we're going to be powerful, and our coercive apparatus is strong enough that we can kill our opposition. Now, one of the things that we will talk about when we talk about cohesion is what happens when you give the order to kill protesters, and then the military leadership says, no, we're not going to do that, right? And this is Egypt in 2012, right? That Mubarak wanted the military to forcibly remove the protesters and maybe even kill opposition leaders, right? And the military said, no, we've always been part of the people. We're stationed and recruited to live near the places that we lived before we joined the military. These are our people. And so they refused to turn on the protesters. And then as soon as that happened, Mubarak realized that he had lost, right? And he leaves. So, right, coercive capacity in these high-intensity situations where it's either kill the opposition or allow them to take power because they've grown so strong, right, really starts to have a different impact. And then the other end of this is low-intensity coercion. And low-intensity coercion happens very subtly, right? It's surveillance and harassment. And so often, instead of, right, soldiers in uniforms, you have paramilitary thugs. These are unofficial, right? They might even be called non-state actors, but that has a lot of coded language. It has a lot of problems with it as well. And so paramilitary thugs They come in, they just look like normal people, they just say, I support the government, or they just attack opposition leaders, opposition meetings, they damage their campaign signs, right? Or, right, and another version that's driven by the state is they deny public services. If you're gonna have an opposition meeting in a building, and I know you're about to have it, I just turn off power to that building. And then it's too cold and too dark for you to have that meeting, right? And so those are low intensity. So when we're talking about state organization, right, we have scope and cohesion. And we're going to have scope and cohesion for both. But for this one, scope is where can the state go? It's always in public places, it's always in public buildings, but is it in private homes? Is it in your home, and is it in your private conversations? When you're having a conversation, is some part of the state's apparatus, where it be, right, wiretaps, right, high technology wiretaps, or right, reading your emails, or whatever it is that we think the government often does, or is it some person in your family, right, your cousin, your nephew, your child, who goes from house to house listening to conversations and reports back to the government, right? Those are both ways in which a government can have a very effective low-intensity coercion, because they can get in every household, right? They can see everything, and coercion requires information. You have to know who the opposition is to make sure that you're opposing and suppressing the opposition. Repressing and suppressing the opposition. The next part is cohesion. We talked about this, right? There's a difference between an illegal and a legal order, right? This was established after World War II, right, in the Geneva Convention, that soldiers have to refuse illegal orders or they can be prosecuted. And whenever you give an illegal order, when you say kill protesters, right, when you're saying fight off these combatants, that's a legal order. But also, if you're fighting a combatant, right, you don't have the same normative calls. Whereas if someone says shoot those protesters, those unarmed protesters, your natural normative response is going to be slightly different. And so cohesion is how willing those subordinates will follow commands, even if they're illegal, right? And it's risky, because if you defect, right, if you say, I'm not going to follow these orders, then the very next step that often happens, you say, well, I'm not going to follow your orders, and you told me to kill civilians, so now I'm going to oppose you, right? If you tell me to kill innocents, and then my choices are kill them or fight against you, right? This is a very big movie trope in the United States, right? Well, you just told me to do the wrong thing, so I'm joining the other side, right? And now I'm going to cause you to have your downfall when I used to work for you. Very, very normal trope in the American system, in American television, right? So we should be familiar with it, right? And its risks, right? That you were a loyal soldier until they gave you an order you couldn't follow, right? In the 80s and 90s, movies were always about this. The factors of this are, one, physical health. If you're not paying your soldiers, they're not going to follow your orders. But it's less of a factor than the other three components. And those are shared ethnic identity, right? Especially with deep ethnic cleavages. If you're a Kurd in Iraq, you're willing to fight and die much more strongly with your other Kurdish people than for the Iraqi Sunnis or the Iraqi Shiites, right? Their identities are different, right? And so you have deep cleavages, and that identity really matters, right? And so you're much more willing to behave in a certain way. If we look at the Israeli Defense Force, right, it is ethnically, right, sort of this Jewish ethnicity. And I'm not making a claim here, I don't want to get into a fight about Israel versus Palestine. But because of that cleavage, often the behavior and the beliefs of the Israeli Defense Force allows them to not hesitate when it comes to engaging with certain aspects of the Palestinian population, right? We see a lot of civilian Palestinians die, and it doesn't weigh as heavily because they feel that their ethnic identity is being attacked, and so they feel that they are in their rights normatively to defend themselves in whatever means that they deem, right? And so you have that in a lot of places. It's just in the West, Israel and Palestine is the most obvious, but Sunnis and Shiites, right, when it comes to Iranians and Iraqis, right, there's this huge difference. The Dutch and the Welsh and the French and Denmark and the Netherlands, right, have these huge ethnic divides that allow them to justify behavior that normally wouldn't be justified. So ethnic identity, when you have different ethnic groups, is a big way to be cohesive. The next is ideology. If you believe you're fighting for the revolution, you might believe that the revolution justifies all of these things that you're doing, right? That in the end, we're going to have this great nation, so it's okay for me to kill these civilians, right? That ideological justification helps people. And the last part is solidarity ties. One of the things that we saw in Egypt is Nasser goes and fights this war, right? And it's sort of this Arab-Israeli war. It's a war sort of fought. And because the United States is back in Israel, and I apologize if it seems like Israel is just the most obvious examples that we have for American audiences to sort of digest. Nasser goes to war with essentially the military that he has against a much more advanced and well-funded Israeli military, and he loses. He loses the war. But he comes back, and the ties that exist, he's a military leader during this war, and the ties that are generated give him so much support that he easily becomes the leader of Egypt. And the party becomes the party of Nasser, right? And even after Nasser leaves power, these Nasserites, the people that believe in the structure, the autocratic structure that Nasser had generated, the sort of competitive authoritarian regime that Nasser had created, they still follow the beliefs and the ideas that Nasser had developed because of that solidarity. That even though they lost the war, they proved that they could stand up to Western powers. They proved that they could stand up and have dignity and respect. And so it just built the solidarity that really strongly created a cohesive bond in Egypt, right, for a long period of time. And so cohesion is not driven by just fiscal health, right? It's easier if you pay your soldiers to get them to follow orders, but ethnicity and ideology and solidarity, those really drive cohesiveness. And we'll see those are the same factors that drive cohesion when we're talking about organizational capacity and cohesion. So that was all the state. So now let's talk about party strength. And in party strength, you have different behaviors that you have to deal with. The first is intra-elite conflict. You don't want your elites to fracture. We know, right? Scottsville talked about this. You don't want your elites to fracture because that's going to cause your party to collapse, right? That's how you allow revolution. The next thing is you need to mobilize support. You need to get people to go out and vote. Remember, competitive authoritarian regimes have voters. So you have to get them out to go and vote, right? And so the local party cells, the youth wings, we'll talk about the youth wings in a minute, right? All of these go out and mobilize. The next part is the youth wing can really supplement the state capacity for coercion, low-intensity coercion, because these young individuals, right, they're easy, like they don't have jobs, right, so they have free time, and so the opportunity cost for them to join this group is very low. So they're more likely to join the incumbent party's, right, youth wing. The other thing is they go everywhere. They're in houses, they're part of the community, and so it's really easy for them to monitor, right, the population, and then report on the population, right? And so it's easier to find opposition and suppress it. And they might even cause their own family members to be arrested, right? We talked about, this is something that gets talked about in sort of authoritarian regimes, is that if you want to rise in power, one of the things that you can do is get your family arrested, and it proves that you're loyal to the party first, and that helps you grow in power, right? So loyalty shifts from family to party. The other part is that every single person you mobilize to be part of the incumbent isn't part of the opposition. Right? It's a zero-sum game. Either you're opposition or you're incumbent. Right? There are only two groups to join that are possible to gain power. And so the more that we mobilize the incumbent, the less opposition there is. So what happens when you have a strong party? The first is you win elections, right? That you can mobilize voters, which means you're going to get more votes, but also you have all of this coordination that allows ballot box stuffing, right? A party official or someone in the youth wing or someone who's just a supporter of the party, right? They go in and they find a ballot box and they're in charge of transferring it to another department, and while they drive it over, they're just stuffing ballots into it to ensure that you win the election, right? And also there's a lot of discretion. right? The youth wing doesn't look, right? They're just wearing normal clothes. So if they go and attack an opposition headquarters, that doesn't mean that they were part of the state. They'll deny that. And because if they have high discipline and they say, okay, I'm part of the party, I know the party line, I don't say when I did something that could make it look bad. They say, no, I did this on my own, this wasn't part of the party, I just wanted to damage that building, I'm a vandal, or you can arrest me, right? And then they get a slap on the wrist because the party controls the judiciary. But it prevents, right? A strong party allows them to win elections through all of these factors while also allowing them to avoid accountability, right? A strong party controls the legislature. If you win elections and you have a legislative body, you go through, when you're appointing judges, when you're appointing other bureaucrats, you have an appointment process. And your party is in control of the legislature, right? When you go through Senate hearings or whatever it is, whatever the appointment process is, you can remove people who don't fit your category, and you can put people in power that support the party by saying they're not qualified or they're not going to get the votes to be in that office, right? And then you can prevent challenges to the executive, right? If you have a strong party organization and cohesion, it'll prevent the legislative branch from trying to create oversight over the leader or promote an opposition group in the legislature, or just a vote of no confidence, right? In a parliamentary system, you can just vote no confidence, that person's gone, right? So if you have a strong control of the legislature, it prevents those things. And then it says solves the successor issue, right? If you have a successor, right, that's loyal to the party and has already won elections to the legislature, they're trustworthy and they're electable. And it solves that successor issue through strong party, and it helps, right, a specific incumbent party stay in power for a long period of time. So scope and cohesion, right? The first is scope, right? We talked about scope in the state senses that they can be in every household. Well, it's not that different with a party, right? Are they everywhere, right? Geographically, are they in every community? And then can the party monitor everyone as best as can possibly monitor? And what we see is in some states, they had an agent representation of the party, the incumbent party, for every 10 households in rural areas, right? That 10 households is about 4 to 8 people a household, right? If you're in charge of just knowing the secrets and the behaviors of about 40 to 80 people, that's not that hard. You live with them, you have dinner with them, you talk to them every day, you work with them in the farms, you work with them in the industry, right? You deal with them on a day-to-day basis, you know their wants, their beliefs, their preferences. It's very easy for you to have that low-intensity coercion of surveillance, right? And then cohesion, right? Preventing elite defection. If there's a crisis and you have a strong party, the party will stay together and the crisis won't damage the behavior. And another thing is that you have to set up a system where the only way to gain power in the government is through the party, right? If we look at the American system, the UK system, if you look at any sort of system that has cohesive party, the parties determine how much power individuals have. So any individual can't be autonomous. They can't say, oh, I get all my power from my ranches and I don't have to listen to anyone. No, my power comes from the party. I have to listen to the party. That's forced cohesion, right? Whether it's resources or appointments or being on certain committees or being in charge of certain things that give you kickbacks, right? The party gives you your power, and therefore you're reliant on the party to stay in the position that you're in. So how do these mechanisms work? The first is patronage, right? We've talked about patronage before. If I give you a job, you're going to support me. I say, support me, give me a job, and then you get a job. And then if I lose power, you know you lose your job. The problem is that when we have a crisis, patronage won't work. Because you don't have the jobs to give, because you don't have the money and the resources to provide, because they're lost, because you're going through an economic crisis or a crisis of some sort. So what we see is cohesion for state capacity is the same as cohesion for party capacity. Ethnicity, ideology, solidarity. The only way that you can maintain cohesion is you have to have some underlying belief that ties you together. If your ethnicity is tied in a certain way, right? We see this happening, right? Now, we did see this happen in the United States in the 1860s, right? This is Jim Crow in the South, right? They tie together under this deep cleavage where whites who are in power sort of create new systems and rules to try and stay in power, to hold onto that power as much as they can, because they believe there's a cleavage between the two groups, right? Ideology, right? that Americans actually become much more cohesive between 1950 and 1990 because we come together against communism. Right now, McCarthyism has its own problems, right? If you were gay or lesbian in the United States between 1959, you faced a host of issues, right? Because McCarthyism started to root out and tied communism, being gay with being communist, this whole mess, right? But the ideology pulls people together, and then solidarity. Anytime you see a group that went to war together, that fought together, that sacrificed together, those ties are going to last for a long period of time. They're just going to be stuck with each other, right? And so when we code this, when Levitsky and Way code this, they say if the ruler just doesn't have a party, or if there's just a brand new patronage party, there's not a lot of cohesion. If you have an institutionalized patronage party where it's still based on patronage, but it's been there for a long time, the rules are set up, then you have medium. And the only place you have high cohesion is through this ethnic and ideological party or a revolutionary party. The problem with a revolutionary party, it's only cohesive for the generation that fought. So as the younger people, the new generation steps in, that cohesiveness breaks down because those people weren't in that conflict, and so they don't have those bonds that the previous generation had. And so it lasts a shorter period of time than ethnicity or ideology. One of the substitutes that we will see for this is economic control. If you control the state, we talked about this, the Geddes and Wright and their oil and autocratic regimes. You can use economics to gain support, right? If everyone that goes against you, you take away their licenses and you make them concessions, or you tax them and audit them in a way that's very punitive, then you're going to see them in support. And if you have a rentier state, you can use those resources that you're gaining, those rents that you're gaining through oil, to pay off your supporters, right? And so economic control can have this very well. The only thing is that the thing that matters here is not just the rewards, but the cost. If you choose to join the opposition, you might be denied contracts, your property can be seized, and if you have a government job, you can be fired and blacklisted. Right? So if you have economic control, you can sort of change the incentive structure so that people don't want to be part of the opposition because it hurts their livelihoods. Now, when we combine state and party strength, right, you can sort of have one replace the other. Right? A highly organized party can engage in surveillance so that state capacity doesn't have to be as high. The state capacity is high. Also, you can use the state, right, the government, the military, the paramilitary groups, to do the surveillance, and then the party doesn't have as much. The problem with this is that whenever you substitute one for the other, you're draining the other part, right? If the party's doing all of the parts that the state should be doing, then it takes more resources away from the party, and it can't fulfill its other roles, right? So while they can be combined, the strongest position is where you have a strong party and a strong state coercive apparatus. Okay, we can't ignore the opposition, right? The opposition exists, and it's a zero-sum game. Every time you get a vote for the opposition, it takes away a vote against for the incumbent, right? So this is a relative gains system, right? The more organized I am compared to how organized the opposition, the better off I will be. So a very low organized opposition and a high organized incumbent is very successful. But a highly organized incumbent and a highly organized opposition, they start to level out, right? So it's relative to how organized the opposition is. When you have a very organized and cohesive opposition party, it also limits things. An organized opposition is going to monitor the election. So vote stealing and ballot box stuffing, those are very difficult to get away with. The other part is that if you're an incumbent and you start to see the opposition is very powerful, you might say, okay, how can I buy you off? How can I co-opt this group? Rather than lose power, how can I take the leaders of this opposition and push them into the incumbent party by providing them resources, by giving them titles? What can I do? And so I tolerate rather than repress the opposition group. I make concessions rather than violently repress, right? Because I see how powerful the opposition is, so the behavior changes. But opposition strength is often endogenous to incumbent strength, right? If I'm a really good incumbent party, if I'm Yeltsin, right, and I'm a very strong incumbent party, and I see that the opposition could go stronger, I'm going to arrest, I'm going to charge the opposition leaders with a crime, I'm going to seize their property. I'm not going to allow an opposition group to grow in strength if I can stop it, right? So there's an endogeneity question here, right? Which comes first? Are they connected? Because incumbent organization can prevent opposition organization if it's cohesive and it has a high capacity and scope. So this is just a path-dependent argument that we see, right? If you have a competitive authoritarian regime with high linkage, then you're probably going to end up as a democracy. If you don't have high linkage, then we look at organizational power. If you have high organizational power, then you're probably going to end up as a stable authoritarian, competitive authoritarian regime. If you don't have organizational power, then we look at leverage. And if you have leverage, right, if you see Western leverage, but you don't have unorganized power, if you don't have unorganized party or state capacity, then you run into unstable, right? If there's high Western leverage, then you have an unstable regime where it changes a lot. But without leverage or linkage, you might be weak, but there's nothing to take over, right? If you look at the African states, yeah, they democratized, but often just formally, because there's no will to become more democratic, because there's no reason for those people those people is a very charged term. There's no reason for African states and the leaders of those states to democratize fully, because there's no resources to compete of. There's nothing to vote over preferences, because they just don't have the capacity or the scope or the organization. Now we have to deal with alternative explanations, but I'm dealing quite quickly because they're sort of denounced, right? Modernization, we talked about this. Do you have to be wealthy enough to be a democracy? That's not a great argument for these, right? Because the breakdown is not clear, right? Low and middle income states are just as likely to become competitive authoritarian, and very few are likely to become democracies, so income level doesn't even matter. Inequality doesn't matter because democratic institutions are capitalist, and therefore they avoid wealth distribution. So the tax burden on Democrats on a democracy is not that different from an authoritarian regime. Elites aren't going to be taxed more in a democracy, right? We know that. The tax burden doesn't jump up because you're a democracy. It might be more reliant on taxes, but putting that money, taking money away from the wealthy and giving it to the poor has always been something that democracies have not been that strong on, because democracies are capitalist by nature, right? They want to avoid wealth distribution because it's been tied to socialism and communism, right? That ideology exists there. And then economic performance. An economic crisis does not seem to have the determinative quality that people say it does. What is the truly impactful thing is linkage and organization. And this has been the argument of Levitsky and Way the entire time. Organization and linkage is what truly impacts the behavior. Well, let's talk about institutional design. If the president has too much or too little power, or if they have too much power, then there's no check, and they're essentially a dictator by the setup there. If a president doesn't have enough power and is constantly dealing with roadblocks and immobilization of government because of the legislative branch, the president might choose to start ruling by decree. It might be easier to rule by decree, and this leads to an authoritarian regime. The problem is this just looks at the formal institutions, right? But the formal institutions aren't telling the whole story. It's the informal institution that often determines behavior. And as in the case of Yeltsin, right, in Russia in 1993, Yeltsin realizes that the rules don't fit with what he's trying to do. So he just closes, he ends the legislature, he writes a new constitution, and so in an authoritarian or competitive authoritarian regime, if we're looking at the rules, we're ignoring the fact that the leaders can just change the rules, or they can use informal apparatus. And then we're not going to talk about role of leadership. Leaders themselves aren't a coercive apparatus. You have to have a coercive apparatus. So it's not just the leader, it's the larger group that is planned. So all of these alternative explanations are lacking. And they're lacking in the ways that Levitsky and Way have talked about when they talk about linkage and when they talk about organizational power. And those are the two things that really matter, linkage and organizational power. So I think I have 1 minute to quickly sum up. They have a partially structuralist argument. They say there's this unique period in time between 1990 and 2008 where states become competitive authoritarian regimes because the Cold War ends and there's just this proliferation. There are incentives to look like a democracy and not be a democracy. And one of those is Western linkage, right? Are you close in proximity to the West? Do you have ties to the West, whether they be economic ties like trade and finance, or social ties, where you have, right, democratic norms, where you have individuals that are educated in the West, right? Different aspects of that. And then, after you take into account the post-Cold War environment and you take into account the linkages that exist, right, that pressure that comes from the international community onto these competitive authoritarian regimes, then you have to look at the domestic factor. And the domestic agency factor is organizational power, incumbent organizational power. Does the state have the coercive power to kill protesters? Does it have the coercive power to monitor everyone and cause cohesion? And does the party also promote that surveillance and cohesion that is expected? And if you have incumbent organizational power, you can hold on to a competitive authoritarian regime for decades and not democratize, and therefore we can treat competitive authoritarianism as a very unique category. Now, I covered a ton of material right at the time. I like that we're sort of hitting that time, sort of all this pressure. I did record this for YouTube. I'm going to keep trying to fix this. I apologize that it's such a headache. Because it's a shorter class, I will definitely have the YouTube live stream and the WebEx for the review on next Friday. You have a quiz up, take it, get your brain working, and then extra credit and exam 2 will be available next Friday at 10 o'clock, and then we'll immediately go into spring break, right? So the exam will be available, you can take it and go into spring break, you can spend all the time with it. So I'm a little over time, I apologize. We're gonna have a shorter class next week to sort of account for this in the exam. Have a good day. I hope to hear from you if you have any questions, and if not, we're going to do a very clear review next Friday. Thank you.